Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the 10 stupidest moments in Star Trek Discovery, and it was really hard for me to narrow it down to so few because so many things in this whole show just made absolutely no sense. I remember one scene when they literally confused infrared with ultraviolet when they said that they were using ultraviolet to detect heat signatures instead of saying infrared, and so that was a blatant mistake, so I'm putting that one as my number 10 mistake. Next is kind of a continuity mistake regarding Zora, the sentient computer of the Discovery, namely that last scene when they left Zora alone for 1,000 years for some kind of secret mission, which made no sense. And the reason it's so annoying to me is because they previously established Zora is a sentient AI computer which has feelings. They had whole episodes dealing with Zora's depression and her loneliness, and someone had to play chess with it to cheer it up and stuff like that. This same computer, they later decided to put it alone for 1,000 years in some nebula just because they had to tie it up with that short track Calypso, and they couldn't come up with a clever way to do it, so they did it in a lazy way of some kind of classified mission which we don't know exactly why it has to be done. And they decided to leave Zora, who can get lonely and all of that, and they decided to entrust the most important ship of the galaxy, the only ship with a working spore drive, and decided to leave it in the hands of this AI computer, which is lonely and depressed for 1,000 years. So that is one of the stupidest moments of the whole show. And also a quick honorable mention to the spore drive itself, which was always stupid in the show, the way it worked, the way it violates all of continuity, how little sense it makes that no one else in the whole galaxy ever invented this same technology again for 1,000 years and they couldn't duplicate it. And that's also the one they decided to just throw away into some nebula for 1,000 years. And so nothing about it makes any sense. And so moving on to number 8, which is the character of Gray. And it's hard to narrow it down to a single moment, but this was the absolute worst character of the whole show. Completely pointless. It started out okay, I actually liked that first episode with that character, but later on it became an imaginary friend of Adira. Later it became a hologram, and then they moved her into a robot body, which is completely indistinguishable from a real biological body. She even talks about becoming a real host again at some point in the future, which makes no sense. And the single most annoying moment is that despite it being an imaginary friend, then a hologram, then a robot, it somehow had horrible skin condition. It had horrible acne, even though it was an artificial body, which was previously a hologram, and somehow both the hologram and the robot body had pimples all over its face. And so that moment was absolutely ridiculous. So I'm putting that one as number 8. And number 7 has to do with that progenitor we saw in the last episode, and specifically that line she said that their goal was to create a bigger diversity of beings in the galaxy. It's so stupid because it's literally the opposite of what they did. What the progenitors did was seeding their own DNA all over the galaxy so that everyone will look like them, to be humanoids. And yet she says that their goal was to create a diversity of beings in the galaxy when literally they did the absolute opposite of that. So that's why it's in number 7. And the next 3 mistakes are all from the later episodes of season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, when they were running away from control, and yet at no point did they think about simply using the spore drive to do it. Instead, they had to concoct that convoluted plot to jump the whole ship to the future, but at no point did they think, hey, why not use the spore drive to simply jump far away and hide the ship somewhere so that it cannot find us or something like that. For some reason, they kind of forgot they had it. And they could have simply solved it by saying maybe Control also duplicated that technology somehow, and that's how it was able to chase them anywhere in the galaxy. But they never said that. For some reason, they simply couldn't use the spore drive to get away, and they did have some lame excuse somewhere that they were using the spore drive to charge that time crystal, and that incapacitated the spore drive. So why not simply first jump very far away, at least a few weeks away, and then start charging the crystal, and that way you'll have plenty of time to do it without worrying about Control reaching you. And yet for some reason no one in the whole ship even suggested that, even thought of that. So I'm putting that one as number 6. And in number 5, I'm putting the fact that they also couldn't communicate with the entire Federation, that Control was sabotaging the subspace relays or something, so they couldn't send the signal anywhere in the galaxy, and yet at the same time they could write letters to their families and send them. And also, the most ridiculous part is when Sarek of Vulcan was able to visit them and come to the Discovery and go back to Vulcan and again to the Discovery. He was using his personal shuttle to come and go from the Discovery whenever he wanted to, and no one ever told him, hey, cannot you give a message to the Federation for us? Can you please go to Earth and tell the Federation President to send some reinforcements to help us or something? And so I'm putting that one as number 5 in my list, since it was so ridiculous. And at number 4, I'm putting that scene of Pike closing a door to save the whole ship from a giant explosion. And someone had to activate the door from the other side, so they used Admiral Kathleen Kennedy to do it. And so Pike was standing behind the door, which they said they have to close this one door to protect the rest of the ship, otherwise the whole ship will blow up. And then he just stands there at the door, which has a window. I guess it might have been transparent aluminum, I guess, but still, it was kind of strange how a transparent window can withstand the explosion that would have destroyed the whole ship, and it does actually destroy a huge chunk of the ship, of the front of the ship. And yet he just stands at that window, at that door, without any problem, without even having any eye damage or anything, just looking directly at that explosion. So that whole scene was absolutely ridiculous, and it was made even more ridiculous by a scene from Strange New Worlds, which is taking place after this, in which people were walking on the outside of the ship in that same area that was blown up in that scene I mentioned, and they were looking at a piece of the hull and saying that that's the oldest unchanged original piece of the Enterprise hull which the ship still had despite all its refits. And that was in the same area that was completely blown up in that episode of Discovery, which they completely forgot about when they made the next show. So that makes that original scene even more ridiculous. And they didn't mention any force field or anything. No, it was just that one door that was somehow able to withstand it. So that was number 4. And number 3 is the giant empty space somewhere inside the ship, which cannot possibly fit anywhere inside the ship, in which for some reason all the turbolifts are flying freely inside some huge empty void somewhere on the ship. And that was first shown in season 2 of Discovery, so that was before the jump to the future. And that was already a problem because that space cannot physically fit anywhere inside the ship, and why would you want to waste so much empty space inside the ship? And then it became even worse when we saw it in season 3 of Discovery, in which it was literally physically too big to fit anywhere on the ship. And one possible way to explain that was to say that because they are now in the distant future, and as we saw in one episode of the prequel show Enterprise, when they encountered a ship from the distant future from around the same time as season 3 of Discovery, and they actually showed us that that ship was bigger on the inside than the outside. So that implies they have some kind of technology that can compress space itself. So we can actually use that as an excuse for what we saw in Discovery with that huge empty space inside the ship which cannot physically fit anywhere in the ship. We can only explain it by saying it's some kind of special technology that they're using, but why would they put all the turbolifts into that space? And also, if we actually break down the movements of all the characters in that specific episode, nothing will make sense regarding where they are actually going and what their goals are, where they are on the ship. There are a whole bunch of internal contradictions with that, and I made a very long video trying to make sense of it, trying to actually make up excuses for the show to try to make it make sense, and it still wouldn't because there are so many internal contradictions. So this is maybe the best example of dumb, stupid, illogical things in the show that makes no sense, but at least that one we can come up with some kind of excuse with that space bending technology I mentioned. And the number 2 moment is one that annoyed me a lot, and that was when Book and Michael were down on some planet. Suddenly they hear a noise in the sky, and Book looks up and says, "Hey, is that my ship?" And meanwhile we saw from outer space, in a big distance from the planet, we saw that his ship was fighting a bigger ship out in space, and somehow he could hear it from the planet, and then look up and somehow recognize his tiny ship from the planet. And it was not some small planet, it was a planet with millions of people. That was his home planet. So how the hell was he able to hear and see his tiny ship, which was in very high orbit of the planet. Some people might excuse it away that it was because of Book's powers, that he has some telepathic powers and that's how he was able to do it, but his telepathic powers were always connected with other living things. It was not about seeing tiny ships in very far distances in space. And so I still would consider that a huge mistake, not just scientific one, but just basic common sense things. And my number one silliest moment in all of Star Trek Discovery is the scene when Empress Georgiou, who just arrived into the far future with the Discovery, is being interrogated by sentient holograms and she's able to deactivate them by blinking in a certain way. That I think is the stupidest moment in the entire show. For lots of reasons. First of all, she's not even from this time period. She's from centuries in the past. So maybe I could buy the fact that in the 23rd century, when holograms were still new and primitive, maybe back then you could do that kind of thing. But you're telling me that centuries later, they would still have the exact same bug? I mean, even in the 24th century, we never saw such a thing. You know, when people got stuck in holodecks, in deadly simulations which were about to kill them, no one ever thought about, hey, let's blink in a certain way to disable all these dangerous holograms. Let's disable Moriarty by blinking a certain way toward him. That actually would be kind of clever if it was like a deliberate design flaw, like if it was a feature, not a bug, like if someone designed it that way, that if you ever get stuck in a holodeck and unable to get out, you can simply turn off all the holograms by blinking a certain way, like a safe word or something. So, and yet nothing like that was ever mentioned in any of the other Star Trek shows, and they always show that when you go into a holodeck, you wouldn't even be able to tell it's holograms. It's so realistic, it's so well done, you wouldn't even know you're in a holodeck while you're in there. So there's absolutely no way to do something like that. And now we're 800 years later in the future, when presumably all the technology is much more advanced, and yet Giorgio, who is not even from this century, is able to simply blink a certain way to disable all these holograms. So that makes absolutely no sense, and there is no way I can come up with any excuse to try to explain it. It's simply too stupid to be explainable. So I'm putting that as the absolute worst, most annoying moment in the entire show. There were, of course, a lot more, which I discussed at length in my detailed reviews of the show. I will link the playlist to my reviews in the end of this video, but I did want to make a quick summary of the most annoying moments. So let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.